You heard about carbon footprints since morning. You heard about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Kani mein twist. Now we will take some softer angles. Softer angle is governance. I was speaking to Anjalee the other day, and we were kind of discussing how this part of ESG is completely missed out when the discussions around ESG are taking place. Anytime you talk about sustainability, it is being always thought about carbon footprints kitne kam kiye, SBTi target liya ki nahi liya, zero waste to landfill hua ki nahi hua. You will hardly find at any point of time discussions happening around how is your corporate governance. I was just Googling yesterday. On the ESG part itself, the trend of ESG, that means the people who have looked up at ESG, has gone up 2.5 times in last 2 years. So whatever was happening in 2019, 2.5 times people have searched the word ESG much more in these times. Why? Climate, we of course know. Social, there are impacts. Have you seen how many organizations have had a trouble time in last few years? You have seen a major bank going down. Did anybody ask a question that where were ESGs? You have seen infrastructure companies going down. Did you check up the governance factors there? I come back from a company called Mahindra. I'll take a step back again. It was 7th Jan 2009. I was sitting with my boss. There was an announcement. There's a debacle in one of the IT companies called Satyam. The stock price of Satyam about a year back, 2008, was about 540 rupees. The day I'm talking about is touched 5 rupees 60 paisa. How much? 5 rupees 60 paisa. Can you imagine the investors? What would have happened to those investors? The pain. Of course, I'll not go into more details, but very prominently we could manage to handle the merger well. There were policy changes, there were improvements, there was a turnaround in the governance. And the first day when we landed between my boss and me in Hyderabad, can you imagine the fear of the people or the employees who were really looking at these aspects? There were fear in their eyes. Stakeholders were not sure whether they will get their money back. Suppliers were not sure what will happen. This is a kind of an impact that social aspect has on, or the governance aspect has on the whole aspect of a company, or even a city, or even a country. Now, with this aspect, I would request my very eminent panelists to introduce themselves and a quick one word of achievement.
I'm Pratyush, looking after ESG sustainability portfolio at LTIMindtree. For me, the key things for entire sustainability process is the best of the governance that brings excellence in the entire process.
Hi, good afternoon. Ram Vaidyanathan. I head environmental sustainability for the Godrej Industries Limited Group, essentially made up of 4 companies. Very difficult to pick out any one thing, but if I had to pick one, I would say transitioning the thought process from looking at ESG as a risk to ESG opportunities for the last few years. I think that's been the big shift.
Perfect.
Thank you. I'm Anjalee Tarapore from HDFC Bank. I head ESG at the bank. In terms of achievements, I think Thank you, Business World, for hosting this today. But the last time you held the Delhi chapter, both HDFC Limited and HDFC Bank were both winners. Today we stand as a merged entity, so I guess our ESG story is stronger. So thank you, Business World.
Hi, I'm Sanjeev, Singhal. I'm a partner with a member firm of Ernst & Young and a Central Council member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, besides being the chair of the UN ISAR Sustainability Board. And I think one thing that we are proud of at ICAI that we are doing is building capacity, both within our members as well as the regulatory standard setting in ESG. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. So we start with the lady panelist first, giving first question. So, Anji, we heard about merger. Now, definitely there would have been some challenges in terms of how the governance when the mergers are happening. How did you handle at HDFC? If you could throw some light on it, and then also see that if these kind of challenges have to happen in future, what were the best practices that could reduce these challenges?
Thank you, Sandeep, and I think our panel really summarizes what's been going on with all the previous panels when we talk about governance. Just from a merger perspective, most of the time, we assess companies from their financial parameters, but increasingly, all companies are going to be assessed, and the weight between financial parameters and non-financial parameters, which we call as sustainability or ESG, or whatever non-financial parameter disclosures are going to weigh in equal weight with financial parameters. So that is the importance of the role of all of us here in this hall. I have to say that when we were looking at the merger, we looked at ensuring that you were ready on day one, which means we announced the merger in April 22, continued to work through different work streams, ESG being one of the critical ones to ensure that you are able to dovetail your policies. A lot of the work was much easier because we were belonging to the same group, so in terms of your overall governance, philosophy, ethics and values were all common. But ultimately, it's really about people, processes and systems, and all these are non-financial parameters. So by whatever garb you want to look at and call it ESG, it's really playing an increasingly important role. Just one moment, I want to just highlight a couple of issues on the importance of what the role of the board will be going forward. And this is applicable to all companies. So boards need to be able to understand emerging risks and recognize that ESG is also a risk. Boards need to be able to review the allocation of oversight responsibilities with respect to ESG matters. It's important to be able to review how ESG is getting embedded in the business strategy. I think boards need to review not the reporting, but the reporting mechanisms within companies. The board needs to be able to verify internal controls. So you're increasingly seeing it's the same rigor that financial parameters go through. I think reviewing policies is important because a lot of geographies today have very polarized views coming out on ESG, and that is a reality that we all need to accept as well. And lastly, it's important for boards to be able to assess their own readiness in terms of education, especially on climate risk. It's an evolving area. And there's a recognition today that ESG as well as climate risk is a key skill metrics of directors. And therefore, companies do need to reach out for help, may need advice, but very clearly, board training is an equal important area that is evolving. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali, and I definitely agree that board's key agenda specifically on ESG has to get more importance during the board discussions, and also this is one of the best practice that we did, Anjali, in Tech Mahindra. We had all the board members trained on ESG, and then we had ESG assurance being done by a third party at a board level. That means all the board level people or the board directors had to go through a test on ESG, and this was again like, kind of brought up into a public domain as such. So, the awareness of the board is very, very important.
This is like how IT was 5 years ago. Today, every director of a bank, for instance, has to go through cybersecurity training. Right. This is just going to evolve in the same direction.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sanjeev, coming to you. I spoke about Satyam. Then we had, few banks and then few infrastructure. And then another very important subject coming into the market is around SDGs. So how this good corporate governance kind of contributing to better SDGs or, helping the companies to achieve their SDG goals? Can you throw some light on it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sandeep. In fact, when we talk about ESG, G is one element of ESG, but normally the focus is on E, lesser focus on S, and probably the least on G. Whereas if it is the reverse, if you simply reverse it, probably you will achieve all the targets because it's all about the governance. And if you look at the SDGs, they are also about governance. Whether you talk about gender equality, and when you translate in terms of the pay parity in the companies or giving opportunities, or if you talk of decent work and economic growth, if you talk of life on land, life below water, it's all about governance. And if the governance is not there, there's greenwashing, and then we have to bring assurance. So it's all about governance. I give you a small example of CSR. CSR was mandated way back. But look at the different approaches the companies are adopting. There are good examples and there are not so good examples. I give you just one or two very small examples. There is one company called Concentrix. I had an opportunity to look at their CSR very closely. They watch it very closely. They make sure that the every rupee spent is measured, monitored, and put to best use. I also run a small NGO called CA Parivar in the North India. During COVID-19, we were really on the ground when the ambulances were charging 2,500 rupees a kilometer in Delhi. We were providing free ambulances. We airlifted oxygen concentrators from China. So if you really make your CSR work, again, that's about governance. So if there is a good governance, I think sustainable development goals achievement will not be a challenge at all.
Absolutely, couldn't have been a better answer, Sanjeev. Ram, coming to you now. See, I discussed about few of the infrastructure companies. I discussed about Satyam case, which I was very closely involved with. How do you think these ethical practices or the issues around corruption will play a negative role, or how the improvements can be brought about in the structure that these kind of issues don't come in future?
I think transparency and traceability of information, having governance structures that are robust enough to almost act as an internal third-party assurance. Right. That's the best way to go about it. The more transparent, the more disclosures you participate in, whether it's BRSS is one part of it, but if you look at CDP, DJSI, MSCI, the more information you put out there, the lesser the chances are that there will be slippages, because you're vetting that information again and again. Creation of independent boards for different subjects. I mean, it's great to have a board which is well versed in everything, but that's often not the reality. But having, the panel has mentioned about CSR, but CSR has mandated that you have to have a board level committee. But not many companies have mandated dedicated ESG committees at the board level. So having that was a real game changer for us, because it provides you a perspective, especially if you ensure that half the ESG committee is made up of external board members. It really gives you a perspective of what the external world really expects of you in terms of your performance and your strategy. And it also keeps you, it toes the line.
Absolutely.
The other very important thing is to link incentives with performance on ethics and other ESG parameters. Ethics is one part of it. Everything, environmental social parameters. You have to make the cost benefit of doing the wrong thing far worse and the incentive for doing the right thing very good. So you make the difference really big.
Right.
then it really disincentivizes. I think so my first ever job was with the Singapore government. I was a civil servant with the Singapore National Environment Agency. And I often wondered why there's not much corruption. The incentive or disincentive to be corrupt is so high. In terms of small penalties on corruption are punished very severely. And your pay packages, your incentives, your bonuses are so good that anybody would even think 20 times before trying to commit any kind of unethical practice. So we need to internally in organizations create those sort of structures that really disincentivize any kind of unethical behavior, and of course have very robust, transparent mechanisms to constantly review this.
Sure. Pratyush, now coming to you, one very important aspect, we said that governance with examples means if there are some practices which could be replicated. Is there something which has happened in your organization which you could highlight to all of us? Any good practice?
Two things, maybe. What we have recently designed, got approved, and across top management cross-cutting is we call it sustainability scorecard. It is mandatory to everyone. It's a cross-cutting. The chief logistics, within chief logistic officer, chief marketing officer, and everyone. So what happens when your sustainability scorecard is being monitored by board committee on sustainability, every quarter, the details report goes to them with respect to the transparency, traceability, petrol, there is a corruption, sexual harassment, human rights, all those parameters and jot together every quarter and put up there. That brings probably best of the governance practices within the organizations. And whether you name same way or something else, anything that doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. So unless you measure it, you can't manage it. And to measure, it has to measure at the top apex body of the company to have the best of the governance practices inbuilt. That is one part of it. Second part of it is there are a lot of challenges when you go ahead with the sustainability, ESG kind of work. Getting support, pull factor is always there from me and Ram and you as a process owner, the department heads. But there is no pull factor at the top management. To bring out that, two things we have done. We have provided best of the training from IIM Ahmedabad. That includes the board independent directors and up to anybody who is a CSCO and the departmental heads. And then this sustainability KPIs goes into that. Now they are learned and they have a KPI in hand. And people start coming and talking to me, Pratyush, क्या करना है पहले बोल दे, मेरा 2% less नहीं deduct होना है. For them at CSCO level, the 2% level of sustainability scorecard is a big deal for them. And not only that, when somebody is learned equally aware of the subject matter, they try to provide the best of support to the concerned department.
Thanks. Anji, again coming to you. In last few sessions, we also heard about, BRSR, CSRD coming up in Europe. We migrated from BRR to BRSR. Now, all these frameworks, from a banking perspective, how do you think are they moving in terms of a transparency and bringing in this kind of a governance that we are looking for?
Right. Thanks, Sandeep. So really in the banking segment, we depend on a large number of customers. The better their data, the better our disclosures will also be, especially when we're talking about financed emissions, for instance, which was in the last segment. But we've spent a lot of time talking about different frameworks. They are evolving. There is a need for green taxonomy. I'm sure this would have been discussed, through the panel discussions throughout the day. But the key important part, given that the fact that we are talking about governance, is that you do not have to win on every ESG parameter. Be honest, communicate with your stakeholders, own your ESG story. I've always maintained that ESG is nothing but a daily narrative of what all of us do at work every day. And the most important part is to be transparent, honest, and consistent in your communication. That will win you a lot more. It's not about getting glossy reports out. I think more and more ESG analysts, stewardship teams are really focusing on hardcore data. And the good part about a framework like the BRSR is that it's an indigenous framework and you're going to get good comparative data. Within the next 3 to 4 years, you will be able to have a very, very rich set of data to compare companies across. Over a period of time, yes, the way is not to have sector agnostic frameworks, but to have them based on sectors, which I think was also a general point that was covered in the earlier panels. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali. And Tech Mahindra is the only company which is reporting on all the 5 frameworks. Now, where I see that it is bringing transparency, it is also saying is that we are giving out the facts. So this is also saying that if we are true to the investors, we would want this kind of a transparency to come into the picture. So we report on TCFD, GRI, SSB, so all these 5 frameworks are kind of part of our integrated report. Ram, now coming to you, specifically now on structure and the framework that an organization can build to incentivize the departments within the organization. How can a framework like that work? And what is the framework that you follow in Godrej?
It's a very good question because I think it's an evolutionary process. And having more stringent value chain based targets really involves the rest of the other functions of the business a lot more. Traditionally, in the first 10 years, typically of an organization's sustainability journey, you will see the operations team involved in pretty much 95%. It's their baby. You look at energy efficiency, water, waste, and evolving from that to a value chain perspective, to think like product stewardship, looking at things like human rights in your value chain, looking at things like de-risking, which is one of the biggest issues which I think a lot of Indian companies do not focus on, is they're doing great work on their impact on the environment and their impact on society. But what are the risks they face from that, and how are they building climate resilience and social resilience and right to operate in communities into their future plans? That is something that only happens when you start involving teams like the supply chain team, R&D teams. Because, for example, is your R&D team really looking at a zero plastic product as an opportunity in the next 10 years? Is that on their horizon? And everything is interlinked. Somebody was talking about LCA earlier. LCA was a starting point to where we are today, saying that that has defined your new product development framework to say these are the boundaries in which you operate now. So everything is interlinked. It's easier said than done. I can't tell you one magic arrow which will say you will solve this entire thing. It's consensus building, very, very important. Education, I think Anjali was talking about this earlier. I think this is one place where we are really lacking. When we say education, we tend to focus on things like, do people understand the technical aspects of ESG? But are they empathetic enough? Have CXOs and the heads of department, heads of businesses, do they really care about ESG? Is that really front and center on the agenda? Are they going to be proactive about it? Are they just going to react to something that's issued from them from the board? That is really critical. So one of the best programs that I would encourage anybody who has the opportunity to do this is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has a sustainability in education program where they're focusing on education not just from a technical perspective, but understanding how to create this kind of EQ on ESG among your top leadership. So things like this are really important because CXOs live in a world where they live and die by stock prices in every 3 to 5 years. But ESG is not something you can solve in 3 to 5 years. So how do you incentivize that sort of long-term thing? It's you have to build in a culture, incentives, recognition, and education. All of this has to flow hand in hand together. It's not something that the CSO or the sustainability team can do. It has to be solved at the strategy level involving all the functions coming to.
100% agree with you. Sanjeev, outside we were just discussing about, the independence of a director. What are your views on it? How can you say that a board's independence is very important? And specifically in today's world when I mentioned about few debacles, how important is the independence of an independent director?
It's extremely, extremely important because when we are talking of governance, independence, it could be met in form, it could be met in substance. As chartered accountant, we always say substance over form. So while the tick boxes are met, that the directors are independent, but if they are really independent, if they can question the management, if they can question the policymakers within the organization, and take care of the real interests of all the stakeholders, that will do a lot of good. And the companies who have real independent directors have progressed very, very well. You have given example of Mahindra, the example of Tata's, and so many other good companies. And those companies, which have failed on this quotient, really struggle to find their ways to win the confidence of the stakeholders. To my mind, it has to be done in substance, and a lot of concrete steps can be done. Just by having a definition of the related party, and if you are outside, you are independent, probably, a lot more needs to be done. Some independent checks needs to be done, and as you said, an ESG questionnaire, probably somewhere an independence questionnaire should also be made.
If the say a norm is 2 independent directors, and if a company goes for 3 or 4, won't that be a better, or won't it be better?
Not necessarily. See, I will say that more is not always better. Reason being, if the regulators, and since I come from a regulatory background, have thought of a balance, that means there are people who can run the company and have an insight from there, and there are people who come from outside. So I'll not be averse to saying if the minimum number of directors, say, is 8, and then you have taken 10, 2 additional independent directors, that is fine. But as far as the composition is concerned, there has to be a minimum number of the executive directors also who will bring that company's perspective and operations perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Sanjeev. Pratyush, now coming to you, and again, Ram, you can just chip in here. The role of a ESG head, or a person who's really looking at the ESG data, how important is it in today's world, and where do you see this panning out?
It's really important because, if you look at the sustainability of your own corporate, own business, none of the board members will shy away with this data. For them, it's a prime things. What the basic ESG data, if somebody analyze, anybody who has good hands-on quantitative techniques and all, can easily find out the loopholes within the company just by going through ESG data. Forget about the financial data and all. If somebody goes very deeply, can easily find out. I'll give 2 examples of my previous organization where I served 12 years. Present, I can't talk. One is Farooq Kabrana sir from Tata Groups, was independent director. Second one was Shailesh Harivakti sir. Each time they will come to the board committee as a chair, as an independent director. I have to prepare for at least 30 days before, and literally I used to keep out 30 FAQs and answer to it. I knew, some question will go out of this. And they were so prepared, going through all data, all details, and bal ka khal ka bal, they will certainly do, and none of those meetings were less than 2 to 3 hours times. So if somebody knows where business is going wrong, the best thing is go through the subsidy data. The financial data will only say this many % growth, that money is plateauing. That's it, nothing beyond. What will happen, the predictive analysis is always comes from your sustainability and ESG data.
100% agree.
Well, on a lighter note, when you mentioned what's the role of the ESG head, during BRSR, it felt like it was everything. Everything was the role of the ESG head. Because
that is what I really wanted to hear. Yeah.
It was all landing up on the ESG heads because fundamentally, because of stronger focus on ESG and disclosures like CDP for the last decade, we were in a better place to actually have assured data available. We've been doing this for a very long time. Compared to some of the other functions possibly, we've gone through the rigor year on year when we submit all of our data for third-party assurance. So a lot of them did look towards the ESG heads to say, okay, what do we do about BRSR as a whole? But the future of the ESG, honestly speaking, A, ESG will have a seat at the strategy table. B, ESG will not be a separate function, according to me. You will have to have the managing committees of the board or whoever, any kind of committee, every single member on that committee will have 20 to 30% of their KRAs and their knowledge linked to ESG. You cannot afford to have a CFO in the next 5 years who does not understand ESG. Absolutely. Because it's fundamentally linked to your financial performance. You cannot afford to have audit or risk teams who don't understand ESG. Because that has to be built in. Yeah, climate risk and resilience has to be part of ERM and what they do. You cannot have R&D who doesn't understand ESG. You can't have supply chain people who don't understand ESG. ESG, my role, honestly, will become redundant in 5-10 years because it will become intrinsic to every single member of the organization and not a separate function going forward.
Thanks so much,
So
Ram.
the best team building exercise in an organization is doing the ESG report.
Yes, definitely. In fact, Anjalee, I was just coming back to you only saying, what is the last note? So, anyway, you have given that.
We've got a time's up sign, right, staring at us.
Yeah, so thanks everyone. And I hope whatever we discussed, it meant that G is a very, very important aspect of ESG. And when the discussions are happening with the investors, the governance plays a major role. Today, 90% of the investors are really looking at what kind of ESG practices a company is following through. There are discussions immediately after the quarterly results with the investors on the ESG parameters. So with this, thank you everyone, and thank you great panelists. Thank you.